I'm Adrian Finnegan, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, African nations are drowning in debt. Their leaders are calling for reform of the global financial architecture. But will US-led multilateral institutions heed the call? China is accused of pushing Africa into a debt trap, but is it? And could Beijing take an even bigger role on the continent where US aid and influence has waned? Beijing and the West are racing for Africa's resources. Who will win the competition for the continent's critical minerals? And how can Africa's potential be unlocked equitably? It is a continent rich in natural resources and with one of the youngest and fastest growing populations. African nations, in theory, have the potential to transform their economies. But many of them are facing mountains of debt. Africa's external debt climbed to more than $650 billion last year. More than half of African countries are either in debt distress or teetering on the edge. But credit restructuring is painstakingly slow, and many governments end up spending more on servicing their debt than on healthcare or education. The debt problem has plunged many nations into economic crisis with rising unemployment and poverty. So, how can Africa get out of that borrowing and poverty cycle? Al Jazeera's Michael Apple reports.
Highly indebted African countries are set to pay record amounts to service debt in the coming years. The UN reports that Africa has seen its debt-to-GDP ratios rise sharply from just over 30% in 2010 to nearly 70% in recent years. In 2020, Zambia declared itself bankrupt, unable to repay debts, which stood at a crippling 129% of GDP. Late last year, Ghana successfully restructured $13 billion in international debt, the largest in Africa to date.
Our catastrophic debt position has also severely impacted infrastructural projects that should have been completed. Currently, there are 55 stalled projects due to the default of debt and subsequent restructuring, with a total value of $2.95 billion not disbursed.
Despite lower debt-to-GDP levels compared with G7 countries, African leaders argue that high costs of borrowing adversely and disproportionately impact developing economies. A grouping of former heads of state recently launched an initiative to tackle Africa's worst debt crisis in 80 years.
The situation may get even worse. These countries will be completely crippled, and they won't do much for the growth and development of their country. All that they'll be doing is collect revenue and service the debt.
A combination of high borrowing rates, rising inflation and poor economic growth has captured the continent in a perpetual debt spiral.
Because African countries are saying, we're not looking for charity. We understand and we are ready to fight, to build our capacities in our countries, to move our economies. But for that to happen, we need a debt relief first.
Reform of institutions like the IMF has been slow, but Africa has recently secured a third seat on the now expanded 25-member board. But critics argue it doesn't go far enough, giving less than 7% of voting rights to a bloc that represents almost 20% of the world's population. And Africa's aversion to Western lenders has seen a shift towards Chinese loans, committing more than $182 billion over the past 2 decades. In the face of criticism, Beijing denies allegations that the often secretive terms of its loans to already debt-ridden countries, for which key infrastructure stands as collateral, traps nations in cycles of debt. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Well, the US appears to be taking a back seat in Africa. This after one of Donald Trump's first executive orders halted all foreign aid through the US Agency for International Development. In 2024, just under a third of the $41 billion in foreign assistance from USAID went to sub-Saharan Africa. The Trump administration has moved to dismantle the agency, stopping more than 80% of its activities. While its shuttering is subject to legal challenges, the biggest loser, of course, is Africa. Total US aid to Africa since the 1960s is estimated to exceed $2.6 trillion. Meanwhile, the president has imposed tariffs on several African nations, with Lesotho, a small impoverished country, the hardest hit. Both the US and China have turned to Africa to meet growing demand for resources, both minerals and rare earths, which are used in a host of industries from defense to semiconductors. The continent is home to an estimated 30% of the world's critical minerals. Africa's production of rare earths in particular is expected to increase from current levels of below 1% to 10% of global supply by 2030. Global demand for rare earths could quadruple in the next few years, and China has reportedly already secured nearly 40% of future African rare earths supply. Africa is planning on becoming a major new rare earth ore exporter this decade. 8 mines in countries including Tanzania, South Africa, Angola, and Malawi are expected to start production by 2029. Let's bring in our panel of experts who are all joining us today from London. Hannah Ryder is the Chief Executive Officer of Development Reimagined, an international development consulting firm specialising in the Africa-China relationship. David Omojamolo is an emerging market economist focusing on Africa at Capital Economics. And Charlie Robertson is an author and the Chief Economic Advisor to the Group CEO of Equity Group Holdings, the largest financial services conglomerate in East and Central Africa. A warm welcome to you all. Hannah, let's start with you. What's behind Africa's debt crisis? Is there one catch-all reason, or is it specific to each individual country?
Thanks for having me on the show. I think the key problem that we can identify is one of expensive debt. If you think about it from a logical perspective, debt isn't necessarily going to be crippling unless you're having to pay it back very quickly and if it's at high interest rates. And unfortunately, the multilateral financial system as it exists right now is in a place where African countries are very constrained in the kind of debt that they can find. And so they have been finding increasingly, especially from the private sector, increasingly expensive debt. But even debt from the IMF, for example, has to be paid back very fast. And so this is what creates the challenges that countries are facing right now. It's not the overall amount of debt. You know, it's 11% of all emerging economy debt is on the African continent. So it's not difficult to deal with. It's also delivering results, but it is expensive. And that's where you get this issue around countries having to pay more in servicing debt than they are paying on, for health and education. And that's because the debt is expensive.
David, who is Africa indebted to, and why are the loans so expensive? Why is Africa unable to negotiate better terms on that debt?
It's an interesting kind of story as to how Africa has got in the situation it has in terms of the different kind of creditors it has. China is obviously a country that's come up a lot recently in these kind of discussions. And the debt to China has increased kind of dramatically kind of over the kind of coming decades as countries have built bigger links with China. Private lenders as well have, kind of as Hannah alluded to, have a big part to play as well. And then you've got your traditional kind of bilateral lenders, kind of Western kind of partner countries, alongside the multilateral kind of system where you get more concessionary funding. It's become harder to kind of bridge those different kind of groups who all have, if a country runs into issues in terms of its debts, how do you bring those different kind of groups together to come to a better solution, whether it's kind of debt relief, giving kind of countries discounts on the debts they owe, extending the length of time they have to pay the debt back, those type of things. So I think that's why we've kind of got to where we are, just because there are so many different kind of stakeholders involved in the debt that African countries owe to these creditors, and kind of bridging those divides is just becoming more difficult.
Charlie, the African Leaders Debt Relief Initiative, signed on the sidelines of the G20 finance ministers meeting in South Africa, is going to push for a revamp of the global lending system to unlock the debt relief that David was talking about there, and more favourable borrowing terms for developing countries. Do you think it's going to get anywhere, though? Is it a realistic goal?
Anything is helpful, in my view. Anything that can help reduce that debt burden, reduce the debt load. Because as Hannah was saying, we so want to see more money going into education, going into health, and just going into economic development. But I mean, the way I explain the burden of debt is by looking at the youth of the continent, which is at many levels a huge advantage in terms of innovation and people coming to the workforce. But youth is also synonymous with not much cash. The average age across much of the continent is about 18 years old. And my 18-year-old daughter, she hasn't got any savings. I didn't when I was 18, and nor does much of the continent of Africa. As you get older, as a country, your median age gets older, your ability to save goes up dramatically. And this is why a country like Morocco can borrow at a few percent. It's got quite high levels of debt, but that doesn't matter because it's got a high level of savings too. So the demographic shift will come, interest burden will fall, but it takes years, decades. And that's why these kind of initiatives are helpful in trying to help bridge the difficult years until we get to that point.
Hannah, how long is it going to take African nations, particularly the developing ones, to get out of this debt hole?
I think the issue is that the multilateral system is, in a sense, meant to correct for the kinds of challenges that Charlie's pointing out, and even for the kinds of challenges that David was pointing out of having a wide range of creditors and so on. The problem is that the multilateral system is extremely difficult to, or has been until now, I guess, extremely difficult to change. No one is really willing, especially those who have been at the forefront of the multilateral system, the Bretton Woods institutions when they were created, the US, UK, France, and so on, are not really willing to enable significant change. So the kinds of things that Charlie's talking about with a country being able to save more as it grows, well, the international system should be enabling countries to borrow more very cheaply at the beginning of that transition, so that then over time they can then manage to actually raise savings themselves without even going to the international system. At the moment, though, what you've had is that rich countries can access a lot of money. African countries, on the other hand, can only access a very small amount. And that's literally the wrong way round.
David, African nations are calling for a complete overhaul of the global financial system. They're not going to get it, though, are they?
It's hard to see how they are going to get it. Hannah's kind of alluded to the kind of US-led multilateral system. If we look at the new Trump administration and what he's said, I think at the beginning of the program there was talk about the aid cuts. There's obviously the tariff kind of storm we've got behind us as well. There's a question as to how interested he or his administration is going to be in these kind of wide-ranging reforms you need to get the debt restructuring done quicker. So countries kind of flirting with debt distress aren't afraid to default because otherwise they're locked out of capital markets for ages. I think it's hard to see how much South Africa under this G20 presidency is going to be able to accomplish. The US hasn't attended some of the recent meetings, for example, and Western partners themselves may be paying more attention to kind of trade-related challenges than the very important and vital, even really important at this current time. It's equally important, debt restructuring. So it's hard to see how you're going to get the progress on these issues. But any bit of help in terms of pushing along the kind of conversation is obviously kind of welcome, but right. A lot more will be needed because a lot of these countries are extremely vulnerable right now with how the external backdrop is looking.
Charlie, let's flip this on its head for a moment. To what extent is it in the richer nations' interest to help Africa with its debt burden right now? What negative impacts are Africa's debt problems having on the more developed world?
Unfortunately, not enough of a problem. When we got the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s, there was so much lending by American banks to Latin America that the entire American banking system was nearly bust. And that gave the Americans a huge incentive to do the Brady bond deal, which helped, in fact, create the whole emerging market asset class. Now, we just don't have that problem now. The debt of Africa is much more diversified than it used to be in the past, partly owed to China, partly owed to Eurobond kind of private sector, partly owed to Western governments or the IMF or the World Bank. So no one's on the hook in quite the same way. And interestingly, one of the things I hear is that the Chinese are reluctant to give debt relief to Africa because they're so paranoid that Chinese states, regions, and local governments might say, well, you gave debt relief to Ethiopia, so why don't you give us debt relief? We're actually Chinese in China. And that would really cause problems for the Chinese banking system. So I think the structure of the situation is people don't care enough. It's not bothering them enough in the West.
Hannah,
or China.
Hannah, what do you make of that? China stands accused of luring African nations into a debt trap. Is it?
Absolutely not. First of all, if you look at the proportion of debt that's owed to China is significantly smaller than the private sector and even the multilaterals themselves, World Bank and IMF put together. At the same time, what we also have to remember is that Chinese debt has gone into, or the debt raised from China by African countries has been raised for specific purposes, in particular infrastructure, which is growth inducing. And that has been contributing positively to economic growth. So it's not a trap. The challenge, I think, is that in many ways, the way that what China has done internally with dealing with the internal debt crisis, especially of local banks, is exactly what we want the multilateral system to do, in the sense of creating extra liquidity for countries who are unable to service their debt very easily, but also creating a big capital injection to allow more infrastructure or other types of spending to happen. And unfortunately, the multilateral system is just so intangible, it just will not shift to be able to do that. And I think that is the fundamental problem that African countries are facing. So this kind of incrementalist approach, which has been the case, ever since the IMF was created and the World Bank was created, we've sort of had to try and deal with the system very, very slowly, with a couple of things, like Charlie mentioned, the Brady bonds, etc., a few small instances of slightly more radical change. It is just not working for the African continent, wasn't designed by the African continent, and therefore needs real radical rehaul.
David, where do you stand on that? Who's the bigger bad guy here as far as debt relief to Africa is concerned? China, the US, the Bretton Woods institutions?
I don't want to sit on the fence and say one person is a bad guy or not, but I think that comes to the crux of the problem. We need these different partners to collaborate because they all own significant amounts of debt. They're significant creditors. They're all significant creditors to kind of African countries. So it's all well and good saying, which I agree with to a point, which Hannah said about China not being the biggest creditor, but it is still a significant creditor. And so when it comes to negotiations, its approach in terms of debt relief can sometimes clash with the approach of kind of multilaterals or bilateral kind of Western lenders as well, private lenders. And there needs to be some kind of collaboration, some kind of thinking about how those differences can be bridged. Otherwise, you run into issues where countries like Zambia are going through restructuring events for years upon years, and countries that are teetering on the edge in terms of kind of debt default are terrified of doing so because they don't want to be the next Zambia. So I know that's a really hard kind of message to land in the times we live in terms of just how much perhaps polarization there is between different countries. But I think that's the only way you're ever really going to get these kind of radical, innovative kind of solutions to ensure debt is sustainable in the continent and these countries can spend the money that is vital for, say, health, education, infrastructure.
Charlie, as we said at the beginning, of course, the continent is teeming with resources, mainly critical minerals, which could help to solve the debt crisis. Are China and the West, though, exploiting African countries? Are the deals that have been done so far benefiting the continent, or are they exploitative? And if they're not exploitative yet, is there a danger that they could become so?
Yeah, I think there's always going to be cases you can find of contracts that don't serve the best interests of the country where the resources are. I think the difficulty about those contracts is that it depends when they get signed along the cycle. You know, when prices of minerals are very, very low, it's very unprofitable to actually spend the 5-10 years worth of investment to hope that someday commodity prices will go up and you'll make a big profit. So you do tend to get better deals from governments at low commodity prices. And then when the prices are up, the governments are saying, oh, so much profit's being made and we're not getting enough of it. And then the mining companies, the commodity guys look exploitative. But I think it's just very difficult to look at it in the long cycle. From a political or a social perspective, it's very hard to see that. So I think the key point is the more resource taken out of the country and sold at a profit, the greater the chances of a current account surplus. Current account surpluses, with trade surpluses, give you lower real interest rates and support growth. At the end of the day, that's going to be one of the best ways that governments can manage their debt burden, is by running current account surpluses through resource export sales.
Hannah, do you agree with that? Is China exploiting Africa?
I think many African countries have had really difficult, problematic deals from a whole range of actors in terms of critical minerals. The main challenge is that what's happening is extraction only. Even though African leaders and governments as a whole, African member states of the African Union, have had this policy of value addition, and they're making that policy even more, strengthening that policy over time. We've seen countries like Ghana, Namibia, Zimbabwe say we're no longer going to let our raw minerals, our raw materials be sent to other countries, exported to other countries without processing and value addition. And I think this is a significant step, a very important step, and we need even more African countries to do that. That's the only way they will be able to come out of this cycle. But I just wanted to mention something also about creditors, because again, I don't want to paint the picture that there is one baddie out there and it's the multilateral system, or there's another baddie out there which is China. I think part of the problem is that many African countries, and even countries across what we might call the global south, are engaging with the system in having creditors all around the table and having the main discussion between the creditors. It's really about listening to African countries and listening, China listening to what African countries need, even as a collective, the multilateral banks listening to what African countries need and shifting the way they do things individually. Forget what everybody else is doing, just do the right thing within your capacity. And I think if we have a multilateral system that does that, that is much more focused on what the borrower needs, we will come to some really, really good outcomes that will be really good for development.
David, I see you nodding there, but I want to ask how much Africa will have been affected by the economic turmoil that we've seen so far in the first few months of the Trump presidency, and who knows what else is to come down the line.
Yeah, no, it's been a bumpy couple of months in terms of President Trump's trade policies, kind of aid policies that you alluded to at the beginning of the program as well. I think the story we're telling in terms of impacts is that from a trade front, especially due to kind of the climb down the 90-day pause in reciprocal tariffs, even with that, we were kind of skeptical that the impact or the direct impact on African economies, or most African economies, would be big, simply because trade with, say, the US, exports sent to the US, are quite small in relation to the other kind of partners that Africans trade with. I think the worry that is probably bigger for governments is the indirect impact of all of this kind of uncertainty, all of the higher tariffs that you're seeing in China, which is obviously a kind of key export partner for many African countries. and what that means for the demand for the exports that Africans kind of send to countries like China, the EU. So I think that's the bigger worry in terms of growth. We've obviously seen commodity prices fall back quite a lot. Oil prices fall to about $65 per barrel. If you look at the kind of budgets of Nigeria and Angola and what they benchmarked, what they assumed oil prices would be, that's a lot lower. So that's a worry too in terms of fiscal strains, which kind of feeds into the debt discussion we've just been having. So it's a worry, all of this kind of turmoil. I think the indirect impact is what we're most kind of worried about, that indirect channel. And yeah, aid is another kind of layer on top of that. It's not as big, but it doesn't help either.
Charlie, final word to you then. There are a lot of problems right now for Africa, but do you see light at the end of the tunnel? Are there reasons to be optimistic?
One thing that I think has made a big difference in the last 2 years is currency levels. We had 2 years ago 50% overvalued Ethiopian birr, 50% overvalued Nigerian naira, about 30% overvalued Egyptian pound. And that was really negative. That was keeping the current accounts in deficit. It was meaning savings were fleeing the country, not being attracted to each of those countries. And what governments and central banks have done is they've brought these currencies to much more competitive levels. In Egypt's case, super cheap. And that, I think, should, over time, with economists, you've always got to say over time, improve the current accounts, get real interest rates down, support exports, and actually support import substitution, because imports become more expensive with the cheaper currencies. So I think that's one of the things that I'm most impressed by in terms of the policymakers' response in the last few years.
OK. There, I'm afraid we must end it. We're out of time. Many thanks indeed. Hannah, David, Charlie, it was good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. And that's our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on the discussion you've just heard, I'm at A. Finnegan on X. Try to remember to use the hashtag AJCTC, please. Or you could drop us a line. Countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. There's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find individual reports, links, and entire editions for you to catch up on. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.